Want to be inspired by extraordinary courage and real life stories? You've come to the right place. Welcome, everyone, to a good place where truth and integrity meet, where I'll be introducing you to today's thought provoking and compelling premier whistleblowers, educators, authors, journalists, humanitarians, celebrities, and they all have one thing in common. They are people of truth and integrity, and many are considered modern day heroes. And I have yet another one of these intriguing guests today, Mr. John Nixon. He was an intelligence analyst and subject matter expert with over 20 years of experience, including assignments in providing analytic support to warfighters in Iraq, and at the highest levels of the U.S. government as a senior leadership analyst for the CIA for 13 years under both Democrat and Republican administrations. He is a frequent contributor to CNN, MSNBC, Sky News, and Arabia. His articles have appeared in Time, The Washington Post, The Cipher Brief, and many more. He is also the author of Amazon's bestseller, Debriefing the President, The Interrogation of Saddam Hussein. And I think it's fascinating and interesting that he was the first person appointed to interrogate him. So I'd like to focus on what led up to his capture. First, I want to welcome you, John. And then I'd like to focus on what led up to his capture, the interrogation itself, and the outcomes. And also, I'm interested in your opinions about the government and politicians. And I would like to hear about how and why you ended up choosing to work for the Central Intelligence Agency. And can we begin there?
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. I'm very excited about today's interview.
Well, me too. I don't know where to begin.
Your schooling, and yeah, go ahead. Your schooling and
okay.
What led up to that?
Yeah, I've always I was always interested in history and in politics, and I went to Hofstra, as you said, and NYU. And then I kind of took a few years off and was doing, I was thinking about going to law school, but then I got I wanted to end up in Washington, D.C. because I felt that D.C. was the center of the universe, and that's where everything happened. So I ended up going to Georgetown, getting a degree there, and it was during that time that I got recruited by the CIA. And it was kind of like a lifelong ambition, because I'd always wanted to work for the CIA because I felt that their mission was an important one, and I also was deeply interested in other countries, other regions of the world. Particularly, I developed a specialty in the Middle East, and I thought it would be a perfect match for me in terms of my interests and my career goals.
And I read that when you were younger, you were inspired by a few books, actually, that helped develop this fascination with politics and in the war and wars.
Yeah. First of all, when I was, I think, 10 years old, my parents took me to see Nicholas and Alexandra, which was about the last Russian Tsar who he and his family were murdered in 1918. And then I was just entranced by it, and I went out and got the book, and I read it. And I was about, like I said, 10 or 11, I think, at the time, and it was a 600-page book. It was the biggest book I'd ever read in my life, and but I devoured it. And then also, when I was a teenager, I remember reading this book. This book that had a profound effect on me was a book called The House on Garibaldi Street, which was by Issa Harel, who was, I think, the head of the Mossad during the time that Adolf Eichmann was basically captured in Argentina and brought back to Israel for trial. And it was, and considering what I ended up doing later in life, it was sort of life imitating art, in the sense that I had no idea at that time. I was, I think, 15. I had no idea that one day I would be interviewing a person who was almost as infamous as Adolf Eichmann. But the thing that really struck me, though, when I was reading that when I was 15 years old, which was that, there are really bad people out there. And it's important to make sure that they if they're committing crimes, they need to face a judge and jury. And it's also important to establish that complicity and that guilt. I was just really struck by the whole story about Eichmann and his capture. And then, 20 some odd years later, I ended up working I went out to Iraq in October of 2003 to help find Saddam Hussein. And within 2 months, we had finally located him, and then I got to talk to him, and it was a very unique experience for somebody who works at the CIA. Not everybody gets to do something like this, and I felt very fortunate in doing it. But on the other hand, it was a very eye-opening experience, and certainly some of the things that I learned raised a lot of doubts about what we were doing in Iraq and why we were there and what our leaders were telling us.
May I ask you, what circumstances led up to the capture of Saddam Hussein by the Special Ops Forces? How did you guys find him exactly?
Oh gosh, I mean, we have been looking since April, and it was just one dry hole after another. And by November, I wasn't sure we were going to ever find him. I thought this was going to be another case of like Osama bin Laden, who just sort of disappeared. And then all of a sudden, the special forces did a series of raids, and the target list was created by us at CIA, and we found this key facilitator, this key bodyguard that Saddam had. And once that happened, then we started to be able to pick up more people, and then we finally found the guy we were really looking for, who was his chief bodyguard. And right before the start of the war, Saddam did something very, very smart. He got rid of all of his bodyguards, the ones that he'd been using for years, and that intelligence services all over the world were looking at and having pictures of and knowing who they were. He pushed those guys away, and he brought in a whole new cadre of bodyguards. And we didn't know anything about these people. We didn't know their names. We didn't know what they looked like. Nothing. We started from scratch. And eventually we identified several, and we found this guy, Muhammad Ibrahim Umar al-Muslit. And he at first he denied that he knew Saddam, and then finally he gave up. And he told us basically, I know where he is, and I can take you to him.
Mm-hmm. And so you were appointed to be the initial person to interrogate him. And I guess one of the first things you were to do was to actually identify him and make sure it was actually him and not a quote unquote body double, even though you stated in the book there really are never a body double.
Yeah, it's one of the most persistent myths out there about Saddam Hussein and Iraq. It's kind of crazy because people still ask me, even reading the book, they still ask me about it. And they still ask me, were there body doubles? And I just have to tell them no. I was originally, my first job, once we found him, was to identify him. And that's what I did that first night, the night of the capture. And then it was after that I was asked to be part of the team. And it was myself and another gentleman who his job was basically to sort of facilitate conversation, to kind of get things going and do so in a way that Saddam didn't feel threatened and then shut down the talking. And my job was basically a subject matter expert, which was to kind of come up with lines of questioning and vet what he's saying against the record and what we knew and what we thought we knew.
Mm-hmm. And when you walked in to the room where he was held and saw him sitting on a metal chair, what went through your head exactly?
It was, we had been through so many, as I said, we went through so many dry holes. And in the back of my head, I'm walking down this hallway. In the back of my head, I'm thinking, they probably have the wrong guy. This can't be happening. And then the door opened, and he was just sitting there. And I just took in this breath of air very quickly, and I just thought, I just thought to myself, holy shit, it's really him. It's really Saddam Hussein. And like I said, my job was to identify him. And I got to say this, the minute I laid eyes on him, I'd been watching videotape of him and photographs of him and watching his every move to the extent that I could from CIA headquarters. And I felt like I already knew the guy. But the minute I laid eyes on him, I said, this can be no one else but him. And, one of the things that struck me most once I got over my shock at seeing him was how sort of calm and collected he was, and how he he just kind of was sitting there, was listening to questions, sort of acted like this is very usual for him. He comes here every Saturday night, and
But
I
he
just
wasn't
thought, wow, this is
belligerent. I thought he was belligerent a little bit in the beginning and then calmed
sure.
down.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, he could be. There were times during our questioning where he, would try to take control, and he could be kind of nasty and sarcastic that first night. But overall, he answered our questions, and he didn't mind them so much. He did. A couple of times he clearly just was like, I'm not going to answer this question, and really at that point in time, my role was really just to sort of make sure it was him. And like I said, I already knew it, but I had this list of questions I had generated, and I figured I might as well go through them with him. And also the people I was with, the military guys there, I mean, everybody had drank the Kool-Aid when it came to the body doubles, and so I had to kind of go ahead with this charade of like making sure it's him and asking the questions. And, and he answered most of them, like I said, he answered most of them truthfully and without a problem.
Can I ask you some of the questions you asked him?
Sure. Well, when the first thing I said to him, first off, I said to him, we're here to ask you some questions, and you're here to answer them truthfully. Do you understand? And he just shook his head. And then I said, when was the last time you saw your sons alive? And he just kind of listened to the translation. And one of the things I learned later on was Saddam had a very good command of English in terms of his ability to listen and understand what you're saying. His English language capability, his speaking of English, was very limited. But he would listen to the translations, even though just because it gave him a few more seconds to think of an answer. But he knew what I was asking, and that's when he got a little belligerent, wanting to know who we were. I'm president of Iraq. I'm Saddam Hussein. Who are you guys? Are you military intelligence? Are you just plain intelligence? And and then he said, identify yourselves to me. And at which point the head of my team stepped in and he said, we're not here to answer your questions. You're here to answer ours. And he listened to that and shook his head and said, I'm not telling you. And then we went, I just decided, this is pointless. Let's go to the next question. And I asked him about his doctors. I asked him about bodyguards. I asked him about, there were a couple of questions that I had to ask in terms of headquarters really wanted answers to these, like where is Ibrahim al-Duri, who was ostensibly his number 2 guy in the government. What happened with this airman Spiker, who was a pilot who had in the first Gulf War, who had parachuted out of his plane and his body had never been retrieved, and we had been trying to find his remains for over a decade. And it was questions like that.
Mm-hmm. And
also, of course, WMD. That was also, WMD was a very, very important question that we had to go into that night.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Yes.
Okay. And then I want to go back just a little bit. When you saw him, you had mentioned in the book that he appeared roughed up. Can you go into that a little bit further?
Yeah. Well, there are 2 stories about that. One is that, first of all, when they went and found him hiding in the spider hole, he was sort of dragged out of it, and in the process, he got roughed up. And I've heard that some of it was from the special forces guys, but I've also heard that a translator that they were using was a Shia. And he started to wail on Saddam. I mean, he really started to hit him. And when I saw him, he had abrasions on his face, on his arms, and he was very, very insulted by it and very upset about it. And he made a point to say to me, look at this, look at these cuts and bruises I have. And he said, if the situations were reversed and we were in your country, and your president was being captured, would we have treated him this way? No, we wouldn't have. And it was kind of a surreal moment because this is a guy, from my standpoint at that time, I remember thinking, this is a guy who's caused so much suffering, and now he's complaining about a few cuts and bruises.
And to go back a little bit to educate, I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I hope I don't interrupt your
Sure.
train of thought. So listeners who maybe aren't familiar with everything that occurs and the war and what's going on in the Middle East, you said that there was a Shia that was one of the interpreters. Is that what you just said?
It was a military interpreter. And
Okay,
he was a Shia, which
so
means
there was a lot of
Shia
in the
the
Sunnis.
Shia had been the underclass of Iraq. Despite the fact that they were 60% of the population of the country, they traditionally, over centuries, have been the underclass. And the Sunnis, who were, smaller in population, they were basically the ones who had they were part of the elite. And the Shia were basically, poor and the uneducated. And Saddam had at times persecuted some of the Shia because he thought they represented a threat to his regime, and there were elements of Shia that were plotting against his regime throughout his entire reign. And on the other hand, there were Shia members of his government. So it wasn't necessarily a sectarian issue. It's more of a loyalty issue. And if he perceives that you're disloyal to him, he will, like during his entire reign, during his entire presidency, if he perceived disloyalty, that was, I think, the worst. That was the worst thing you could possibly do, and the surest way you could get yourself thrown in jail or killed.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And so let's go back to some of the other questions that I know, a couple of questions that were in the book. I was curious of some of the more in-depth questions that maybe weren't included in the book, but you talked about his father, or he talked about his father.
Yes.
Can you go into depth about that and how he thought of his father? Because people they assumed he had a horrible childhood, but then when he talked about his father, that wasn't completely true from what it sounds like.
Yeah, one of the things that, in terms of trying to understand who this man was and what his regime was like, I read a great deal about him by scholars who had written about him and studied him. I looked through all the intelligence, and and one of the things I discovered is that there was a mythology that Saddam partially created by himself, but that others filled in for, in terms of, because we didn't really have a lot of contact with him per se over the years, these myths just kind of bubbled up and became sort of a caricature that we created about him. And one was that, he had this terrible childhood, and that his father beat him, and that because his father his stepfather had beaten him, because his father actually died, his real father
That's right.
died
now I remember
during his wife's pregnancy before Saddam was born, and that he was raised by a sort of an evil stepfather. And you would hear these scholars say, well, that's why he wants weapons of mass destruction, because he had this terrible childhood, and he wants to protect himself, And then I'm talking to him, and I would ask him questions about his family, about his wife, both wives, his children, and I asked him about his father, what it was like growing up. And it was one of these things where he told me something, and I just sort of shook my head and said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Tell me more." And basically, what he said was that he loved his stepfather, and that his stepfather was the person he credits with making Saddam Hussein a success in terms of his political life and his life in general. He said that his stepfather encouraged him to move to Baghdad, and also he was able to use some of his stepfather's contacts within political circles in Baghdad, and also through his family, that really elevated Saddam's station in life. And he seemed genuine about this, and I couldn't pick out a reason for why he would be lying about this. He loved him and had only good things to say about it. And it was one of those moments where I start to begin to question what it is we know or thought we knew. And now and there were lots of moments like this during my time with Saddam Hussein where he's sort of knocking down the caricature, and it's like he's filling something in that we never really knew before. And then I started to see how kind of phony some of this information that we had about him really was.
And the people you gave your opinion about the people who analyzed his psychology and his mental health and the way they tied in his personality because of his childhood. And you said you thought it was bullshit, basically, and that you lost respect for that field.
Yeah, well, the thing is, people, and we do it in this country, where we have a political leader and we don't really know that much about the person. And then we start sort of filling in the unknown areas and projecting our own sort of hopes and desires onto this person. And then we build them up, and then we realize that they're not who we thought they were. Mm-hmm. And in Saddam's case, he's a perfect example of this. All of a sudden, we do this a lot in the United States, where we find this world leader that we don't like, and we turn them into this boogeyman, this monster, and we've been doing it for decades. We did it with Nasser. We did it with Egypt, President Nasser of Egypt. Then Yasser Arafat became the evil guy. Then it became the Ayatollah Khomeini. Then it was Gaddafi. Then it was Saddam. And one of the key moments that when we start to demonize a world leader, one of the key moments comes when one of our political leaders says that person's just like Hitler. Mm-hmm. and that's what George H.W. Bush did. He likened Saddam Hussein to Hitler, and we do ourselves a disservice when this happens, because who wants to negotiate with Hitler? You can't negotiate with a Hitler. And mm-hmm. once that happens, we shut off so many other avenues or possibilities, and really our intent becomes very one layered, and it's the intent is that we have to get rid of this person, and then we fool ourselves into thinking if we just get rid of this one person, everything's going to be fine. Mm-hmm. And I saw that a lot during this war, because it wasn't just Saddam Hussein. I also worked on the effort to find a terrorist named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi mm-hmm. In 2006, and our political leaders, our military leaders, got themselves worked up into a lather over this guy, and it just became this quest to find him and get him, and either put him in jail or kill him, and then this mentality takes over that, if we just get this guy, everything's going to be fine. It'll be smooth sailing after this. Mm-hmm. And you know what? It felt great for a day once they got him and they killed him. Felt great. We had taken this brutal terrorist off the streets, and then the next day, back to work, because there's just as much to do now as there was the day before.
Mm-hmm. And one question, this is a very important question, I'm sure people out there are wondering this themselves. How did you know that what Saddam was saying was the truth? Because I know, or I believe, you didn't even use lie detectors during the entire interrogation. Is that true?
Yeah, no, we didn't use. First of all, my own personal belief is that the polygraph, which is known as the lie detector, is a very imperfect tool, and I personally don't have a lot of trust in it in terms of ferreting out truth. But in Saddam's case, every night I would type up my notes, and I would give them to the person who kind of put them into cable form and sent them back to the United States. And then I would go back and, through research, start looking at our records, and if there was things there were things that I knew and felt that I knew, and then there were things that I really was unsure about, and I would have to go back and see what we know and see what kind of confidence we had in that, and it was a very exhausting process.
Mm-hmm, it sounds like it. To go back to some of the questions, because I just found these notes I'd taken down. One of the questions, this is fascinating. We got a commercial. We'll be right back. John Nixon. In case you're joining us late, he's the first man to interrogate Saddam Hussein and an author, previous CIA analyst. So thank you, John. Let's get back to where we were. So what I was asking you was more about the questions. And one of the questions that you presented to Saddam Hussein was his favorite leaders and who he admired. And can you tell everybody, this is what blows my mind, that one of the people he mentioned was George Washington.
Yes.
And that really surprised me.
No, well, it kind of blew me away. Again, we have to talk about Saddam the myth, which we had always been told by so many experts that Saddam's political heroes were Hitler and Stalin. And, and I expected him to say Hitler and Stalin. And so instead he says George Washington and Charles de Gaulle and Lenin, and these were all, at first it struck me as odd and kind of bizarre. But then I thought about it, and really what it is these were all people who were basically the father of their countries. They're the people that started the regime and made their country a modern country. And I think Saddam identified greatly with that. One time, if I can tell this brief anecdote, one time we were talking to him, and he was trying to, he wanted to shut down the session, and he said, it's time for me to pray. And he would do that every now and then because he knew we couldn't stop him from praying, that he was guaranteed this right. And so we said, we'll do that in a few minutes. And we didn't want to let him get control of when we could stop and start. And so my colleague said, Saddam, he decided to just sort of butter him up a little bit. He said, you remind me a lot about Abraham Lincoln. And Saddam looked at him and he said, how so? And then so he started saying, well, you're both the father of your country. You didn't have any military background, and yet you led your country victoriously in war. And he made all these allusions to Lincoln and how similar Saddam was. And then finally, a GI comes to the door, knocks on it. He goes, okay, we'll take him to prayer. And then we said, okay, Saddam, it's time for your prayer time. He's like, no, let's keep talking. And he just loved it. He loved to talk about himself, and he loved it when you compared him to a great political leader, and because he knew that Lincoln is considered by many Americans to be the greatest president.
And how else did he view himself? What opinions did he give you as far as himself and his perspective?
He was first of all, he was a man who, God, that's a great question. He was a man who I think saw himself and his rule as the culmination of the greatness of the Iraqi people, and it set about making sure that there would be monuments to himself all over the country, and that he also saw himself as a modernizer, a man who was taking a backward country and making it modern. And he also saw, I think, he saw himself as a benevolent ruler, but a person who couldn't be trifled with, and that if somebody was being disloyal, as I said before, they needed to be taught a lesson. And he was very, if I can say this also, he's somebody who understood the needs of Iraqis, whether they were Kurds, whether they were the Shia or the Sunni, or Yazidi or Assyrians or any other sect within his country, somebody who had innate political skills and was very good at sizing up a situation and learning how he can manipulate you into doing what it is he wanted you to do, and what is it you wanted in return, and how he could provide that to you, provided that you did what he wanted you to do. He had enormous political skills. The one area, though, where Saddam was really lacking was his understanding of international relations and how the international system of countries and diplomatic relations and military stuff, how that worked. and the interplay between international relations and international politics. He was out of his depth in that regard, and some of his biggest mistakes came in that category.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then the one last thing I wanted to discuss about the actual interrogation is that this is just a little interesting piece. He considered himself a writer, and that he was
Oh yeah.
upset that he couldn't have a pen. He was very upset about not being able to write.
You first of all, I can say this: when he was captured, there was about 700 pages of a novel that he was writing. And we had it translated, and that was one of my first tasks was to start going through the novel and seeing if there are any clues that we could get from that. And the portions that I read, I can say this quite definitively: he was the worst writer in the history of the world. I mean, even if you were trying to write poorly, you couldn't do it this bad. But he considered himself a great writer, and he'd written several novels. And in fact, at the time of the invasion, he was working, basically, he had really turned over much of the day-to-day operations of the government to his lieutenants and was working on his novel when, the Americans came into the country. He was very upset that he had all this time on his hands now, being a prisoner, and that nobody would permit him to have a pad and paper and a pen so that he could write, because he wanted the novel that had been confiscated. He wanted that back, and couldn't understand why this was happening. And we explained to him that the U.S. military was in charge of his feeding and care, and they were afraid that he might use a pen or a pencil to harm himself or try to kill himself.
Right.
And
let's jump forward. I'm so sorry. We only have about 15 minutes.
Sure. Meanwhile, the thing is, Saddam was the last person in the world who would kill himself. People like Saddam Hussein are survivors. They're not martyrs.
Mm-hmm. And so let's jump forward to the debriefing. This part's very interesting to me as well, and it'll be interesting to our listeners.
Sure.
Okay, so how did that come about? What was said? Like, I know, well, this is kind of going back a little bit about Bush, but I'll just let you answer.
Well, the debriefing, I think what happened was, everybody, at the time we were looking for him, there were all these reports that said he was going to kill himself, that he was going to blow up. He has suicide vests, and he was just going to go down in a blaze of glory. And we at CIA said, again, this guy is not a martyr. He's not going to do this. But yet, the more we said that, the more the military believed that he was going to, and they have to protect their troops. So, eventually he's captured. And then all of a sudden, Washington finds out that Saddam Hussein is in U.S. custody. And for a week, between the capture on the 13th and the 20th, nobody came and saw him because we were still waiting for Washington to tell us what it is they wanted to do with him. And, we were pretty sure that he wouldn't be handed over to the International Criminal Court. There was no Iraqi government to try him at the time. And we didn't think he would be brought back to the States, but we basically, he just sat in his cell, and we waited for Washington to tell us. And then one day, we hear on CNN that CIA is going to debrief Saddam Hussein. And I thought it was kind of odd that we're hearing this on CNN and that it still hadn't been communicated to us yet, but eventually it was. And so CIA was given first crack at him and debriefing him and seeing if we could get some answers to questions, particularly questions about weapons of mass destruction.
Mm-hmm. And how did the president, who addressed the president initially? Because one of the things I was reading, and I hope I'm not going too out of order here, that Bush was one of the first presidents who actually wanted to hear from the CIA analyst directly because he was worried about information being filtered before it got to his desk.
Yeah, that was a few years later. But the thing is, I wouldn't say filtered. Well, I think what happened was early on, the CIA would give him memos and give him intelligence briefings, and something they listened, and the things they wanted to believe and the things that matched their own beliefs, they listened to. And if we contradicted what their preconceived ideas were, they ignored us. By 2007, the war had been not going very well at all, and in 2007 came the surge and the Anbar the Sunni tribal awakening, which helped turn things around. But by that point, there was still the administration was still looking for answers to solve this problem of Iraq, and they began to reach out to the analysts because they felt that was probably a lot of viewpoints that they weren't hearing because there were so many layers, particularly in the analytic portion of the product that went down to the White House. There was so many layers of review and editing that a lot of this stuff got stripped out, a lot of the nuance. And now all of a sudden they wanted answers, and they wanted to hear that nuance because the war had turned into such a fiasco. And that's eventually one of the reasons why I got to do a couple of those briefings with the president and the vice president.
And what was his reaction?
I went in there once with a good news story about Muqtada al-Sadr, and it matched exactly what they were hoping to hear. And I was like the greatest thing since sliced bread. The president thought the paper was excellent, one of the best that he'd ever seen. It really told him about who this guy Sadr was, and we went through a series of questions. And I came back to headquarters, and everybody was just glowing. It was just wonderful, and I was walking. I was walking on water that day for the 7th floor of the CIA. I went down about 2 months later and gave him, unbeknownst to me, had to give him a briefing on Sadr that was not on the agenda for that day. And then all of a sudden, he just dismissed the briefing and said, and wanted a briefing on Sadr right then and there. And I had to put this together in less than 5 seconds. And I told him what I thought. And the minute I said that I think Sadr is going to be around with us for a long time. He's going to have a very important role to play in Iraqi politics. And, and Bush just looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what are you talking about? Because he had been hearing from so many other people that Sadr was finished, that he was no longer a force, and we didn't have to worry about him anymore. And, and the reaction to this was one of dismay and hostility. And I spent 30 minutes in the White House, in the Oval Office, with what I termed the entire evil empire. I mean, Gates was there, Condoleezza Rice was there, Stephen Hadley was there. Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was there. They were all there, and all of a sudden they started throwing very hostile questions at me, and questioning my judgment and my knowledge. And at one point, the president even said to me, he said, I think you people at CIA don't know what you're talking about. And I just kind of hung tough, and I said, well, sir, and then I made this comment about, there are people that still rever. I said there are people that still rever Saddam's memory, and he looked at me again like, are you crazy? I gave these people freedom. I gave these people democracy. And I'm like, yes, but not everybody feels that way, And I think that one of the things that happened that was really kind of striking was when we got done. I mean, he was pissed. He was really pissed off, and we walked out, and then we had to wait for the regular briefer, who was still in there. But when they were done and they all came out, most of the principals that had been in the Oval Office that morning came over to me and shook my hand, and I think they did that because they realized that I was saying things that really needed to be said, but that nobody else wanted to say. And that because Bush had this sort of us and them mentality, and you either agreed with him. He wanted agreement all the time. And if you didn't agree with him, then you were being disloyal. In that sense, he was a bit like Saddam Hussein himself. Mm-hmm. And it was a rough day when I got back to headquarters. Oh my God. I felt like one of these people, like I felt like Trotsky, and it was just like I felt like they were going to just airbrush me out of the building. It was a very disillusioning moment because up until that time I done my best, and then to see that these people couldn't see that what I was telling them was the truth, and that they wouldn't accept it, and felt that I had some sort of ulterior motive. And to question my integrity like that, it was crazy. And the only thing I can say in my defense now is that so I was right. I was correct in what I said, and that's the thing that I live with and makes me proud that I did what I did. Because if I'd gone in there and said to him, "Oh, you're right, Mr. President, you don't have to worry about this anymore," I would be ashamed of myself today.
Definitely a black and white thinker, which is different from his father. It sounds, he seemed to be more reflective. What's the word? He understood the gray area, I think is the words you used, or the sentence you used.
George H.W. Bush was, when it came to understanding intelligence, because he had been a director of the CIA in the 70s. He understood he understood intelligence. He understood what it could do, what it couldn't do. He understood how to read a memo. He understood that this is not, there are no absolute truths in anything. And the role of intelligence is to inform, and maybe from that information to create options for yourself. And also George H.W. Bush was a very experienced guy. He had decades of experience in foreign affairs, and he was a smart man. And his son had none of these skills. And his son understood politics, but that was about it. And his son, was not a guy who had ever done a lot of traveling, nor did he have a whole lot of knowledge about the Middle East. And and his son had preconceived ideas about what the Middle East was. And when it comes down to it, I like to tell people that really what happens with the Iraq War, and the reason we go to war against Iraq, is that you have these compelling narratives coming out of the administration. One is that the president thinks that Saddam Hussein tried to kill his father. And then you've got the neocons around the vice president and then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who want to, after 9/11, want to do something about terrorism in the Middle East, and want to strike back at it and change the Middle East and make it more amenable to American interests. And you take these two initiatives and you combine them, and it becomes an overwhelming wave that anybody gets in front of is crushed by.
And I know, at least one of the interviews I saw with you, that you're not a big fan of politicians in general, or even the CIA and the agencies. Maybe certain areas, or it just sounds like you're a little disappointed, and the lack of communication that goes on as a whole.
Yeah, what it came down to is, first of all, as far as politicians go, what it came down to, I always had this core belief that if you put the right information in front of the right person, then they'll know what to do with it, and it will be a success. And the war in Iraq killed that belief for me. And as far as and that most politicians, almost all of them, will act on their own political interests, and they won't do the right thing. They will do whatever it is they want to do. And if the intelligence supports what they want to do, great. If it doesn't, well, intelligence be damned. I'm still going to do this. I'm going to do what I want to do.
That's very sad.
Yes, it is. It's very wrong. And as far as the CIA goes, I just felt that there was this overwhelming desire to please the president. In fact, the day that I had the argument with Bush, it was a few days later, and I talked to one of my managers, and I said, "Well, what's being said about this?" Because I was being given really the cold shoulder by a lot of people, and he said, "Well, basically the president wasn't pleased." And I said, "That's our job, to please the president?" I said that nobody told me. When I first started this job, I was told that we speak truth to power, and now you're telling me that I didn't please the president. I said that's ridiculous. And
go ahead.
No, and it infuriated me.
And so you started to think, I guess, in 2006, you'd finally had enough, and you decided it was time to leave the agency.
That was when I first started the agency. I was like, this. I'm going to be at this for the rest of my life. I loved it, and I still do. I love the substance of the work that I did there. But after a while, you just, it's the mediocrities and the bureaucratic mindset of people that just want to just cover their ass. and that just really got to me after a while. And when I just saw what a disaster this war was, and how we had basically been complicit in a lot of what happened, I just got kind of fed up. And 2006 is when I first started thinking about leaving the agency, and I finally left it in 2011. But
I see.
yeah, so I mean, it was just it was I hadn't even worked on a resume in years because I was so happy there. And then after a while, I just said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore.
Which led you left, and then you wrote your book. And then also, one thing you said in your book is that memoirs began to appear after all of this, everything that you experienced, and that you were again shocked by the inaccuracy in them. How so? And I know you mentioned Bush's book, and you said it was just a defense. It was a defensive book on his belief that Saddam was a threat to the United States.
Oh yeah, whether it was Bush or Rumsfeld or Cheney or Tony Blair, I would read these things, and there were things in there that I directly worked on, and what I was seeing in their books were lies, and they can't be categorized as misinterpretations. They are lies. And like, for example, Bush and Rumsfeld and all kept on talking about how Saddam was going to kill the Bush daughters, Jenna and Barbara. And I can tell you emphatically that Saddam Hussein couldn't even get his mail, let alone he would be sending hit squads to the United States to kill the Bush daughters. And yet they still would trot out this story as some sort of justification. And we're still seeing it today, where the U.S. Army just issued its history of the Iraq War. And basically they have used the viewpoints of these pseudo-scholars who claim that Saddam was some sort of secret Islamist and that Saddam helped create ISIS, and therefore there was a justification for this war. And nothing could be further from the truth. We're still telling ourselves lies about this war. And that's one of the things one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book, was that I wanted to set the record straight, because there have been too many lies told about this war. And it's time to start opening up and being truthful to ourselves, because it's the only way we're ever going to learn anything from this conflict.
No, and I know you're very concerned that all this information is going down in history, and it's going to be inaccurate. And it's probably been happening since the beginning of the government, or since the beginning of memoirs, so to speak, or
yeah,
whatever. You just said it's
degree.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, all memoirs are going to be self-serving. But something that's one of the things when I wrote my book, I was, because it is sort of a memoir, and I was like, I'm going to tell the truth. And believe me, I've lost friendships from this, and a lot of people didn't like the book, and a lot of people did like the book. And something, as far as George Tenet goes, or the leader, or John McLaughlin, or the leadership of the CIA during those years, they all wrote their books, and I read them, and George Tenet's book is a very interesting book. A lot of it's false, but so be it. He got $4 million for his book. I didn't come anywhere close, but the thing is, I didn't write it for money. I wrote it because, again, it's the truth.
And integrity. That's why you're on this show. And so where can people purchase your book? And also, maybe if we have just a couple of minutes here, you were a commentator after you left. You were a commentator for CNN and NBC, and you did all this great work, and you appeared in the New York Times, and now you're doing something else. Are you allowed to share that information?
I'll just say that I'm a contractor in the DC area, and I think I would prefer to just leave it at that.
Okay, sounds good.
One of the reasons I do it, though, is because in this great country of ours, we don't have healthcare. Well, you have to, in order to get healthcare, you need to have a job. And my wife is very sick. And,
no, sorry.
Yeah.
That's disgusting to me. You will hear the anger in my voice. Anytime healthcare gets brought up, it's disgusting. My family was Swedish, and they were taken care of. This, in some ways, so these socialist countries have better. At least you're taken care of. You're not stuck with this insurance nightmare that goes on. Yeah.
It's a human right.
I want to keep it on you. Where can people purchase your book, and what other information what do you suggest if people want to research this topic more?
Oh, well, they can purchase my book on Amazon or go to Barnes and Noble. They can, any booksellers online, and it's still in print in bookstores, although bookstores aren't as prevalent as they once were. And it's also being made into a movie.
Oh,
We're working
wow.
we're
Great.
working on the screenplay right now, and I'm hoping I have a lot of hope for the movie version. And as far as there are a number of very, very good books
I
on
think we're
this
not going to have
war.
time for that because we just have a few more
Okay.
seconds, but I just want to say thank you. I hope you come back. There's so many questions I have for you, and I wish you the best of luck with this movie. And if you want to listen to this interview or you didn't get it in its entirety, you can look it up tomorrow on my YouTube channel, which is A Good Place with Ella. Just search that. Thank you so much.